Hey, it's Lisa Wimberger here. I'm the founder of Neurosculpting, and I have helped thousands of people learn really powerful tools to regulate their minds and their bodies, including pro athletes, entrepreneurs, and those with serious stress-based illnesses. So I'm really excited to help you do the very same thing through education and some incredible guest experts. And together, we're going to discover the formula to unlock hope. So welcome. I'm really, really happy to have Dr. Ben Rein with us today. This is going to be a really exciting conversation. Dr. Ben Rein is a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University and a science communicator on social media. He focuses on exploring the neural basis of empathy, and something I'm very interested in, he's exploring the mechanisms by which empathic behaviors can actually be enhanced. He has lots of published research out there. I've been geeking out on some of it, and I'm really excited to have you with us today, Ben. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. I can already tell this is going to be an exciting conversation.
Yay. Okay, so I have a million neuroscience questions, but before that, I feel like you're a new breed of scientist in that you are kind of at the forefront of using social media to disseminate really digestible, important information. And I don't know that social media influencer and scientist have gone hand in hand. But I'm curious, two things that I'd love to jump in on. One, why neuroscience? And two, why social media?
Well, first, thank you so much for your kind words. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I would agree that I am at a very unique intersection between science and social media. There really are not too many scientists on social media, doing education. Of course, I'm sure scientists have a personal Instagram or something like that, but not too many using these platforms to reach the public. I'll start with answering the first question, why neuroscience? So it's actually kind of funny because both of the answers to those questions are very sort of unintentional. I was a student in psychology in undergrad because I was interested in human behavior. I was interested in why people made the decisions that they did. And if we could sort of classify behaviors, we could better understand humanity.
Did this come from you trying to understand yourself at all?
I was actually trying to understand others. So
Great.
I was interested in social behavior, and I still am now. That's what I study. But I thought it was interesting because, in high school, I was, this is kind of embarrassing to say out loud, but I was one of the popular kids. Okay. And so there was.
Lucky you.
I know. And it's, I hate that I just said that, but it's like, the reason I'm saying that is because you get this kind of view of like your whole high school, right? And so you see there's the popular kids and then there's the kids who like want to hang out with the popular kids, and then there's the like unpopular kids, and then the sort of like don't really care where they fit in, and you just sort of like I have a vision of sitting in my high school cafeteria and looking around and just thinking about how interesting it was that some groups naturally coalesce with 20 or 30 people all talking loudly, very social. And then you have other groups where it's a few people and they're sitting quietly and they're having a tea. And then you have other students who are in the cafeteria, but they're sitting alone and they're reading a book, and it's just, I thought it was so interesting that you take any sample of people and you can see this very broad spectrum of social expression and interest in social behavior. And those changes or those differences, they all reflect differences in how the brain's functioning. And because social behavior is such a complex phenomenon for the brain to regulate.
So would you say there's state change from one group to the other? If you could look at their brains, would there actually be a state change or just different circuitry working?
So I would say that in general, if you're engaging in a social interaction, probably regardless of whether you're extroverted, introverted, you're enjoying the conversation or you don't really want to be in it, generally the brain state, and what I mean by that is like the pattern of activity that you would observe is probably the same or very similar at least And then, on the other hand, if you're sitting alone, it's probably very similar. But I think that the minor differences that probably underlie those two people is like the engagement of the reward circuitry. That some people
Ah,
are enjoying it, they're getting pleasure from it. Others are not. Um, and so this reward circuitry that sort of guides your behavior and shifts, oh, well, what do I want to do right now? Do I want to go talk to those people, or do I want to go sit on my phone, play a game, or go on Twitter or something? Those decisions will be influenced by how your reward circuitry is engaged during those interactions, I think. Um, so yeah, so I was interested in this, and I went to school for psychology, and I ended up I guess there's a long version of the story and a short version. I'll give you the short version. I was in my second to last year, and I had a like unbelievably terrifying nightmare that woke me up. And um, as soon as it was one of those where you wake up and you are alarmed, right? Like you are just like I could sprint for 5 miles straight, no problem. And you just wake up and you're electrified, right? It's so
wow.
scary. And so I had no choice really but to sit there and think, because I couldn't fall back asleep. And I spent a lot of time thinking about my experience and what could have possibly led me there. How in the world it was possible that I was fully immersed in a entirely realistic experience. There's sounds, there's sensations, being like touched by stuff. I could feel everything, I could see everything, I
Mm,
could hear everything. And it was everything I was afraid of. But the amazing thing was that
wow.
everything I was interacting with was also generated by my brain. So I was experiencing the sensation of being in a place, and my brain was generating my surroundings. And I had no awareness that my brain could be doing both at the same time. My brain was doing both.
It's like a recursive metaverse. You're in it and you're creating it by being in it.
Yeah.
It's very
And
metaphysical.
yeah, and I mean, and we do it every night, right? This is dreaming. It's amazing. I'm very interested in dreams, and this is what led me into neuroscience. So I woke up and I thought, you know, we have this unbelievably powerful organ just hanging out in our heads, all of us. And I want to know a little bit more about how it's doing the things it's doing, because if it's powerful enough to shape these metaphysical states, like these amazing dreamscapes, then I want to know the type of power that's going into making those social decisions that you can observe
Mm.
anywhere you go. And so I changed my major and my focus into neuroscience. And a couple of years later, I ended up landing in my PhD studying autism. And I actually never really put it together until a few years after I joined the lab that I was studying social behavior and I was studying
Yes.
those natural
Completely,
differences.
completely with autism or
Yeah,
the lack thereof, right? The lack of social connection.
right, exactly. And that's why I really enjoyed my PhD research, because, studying autism is a great way to explore the neural circuits that underlie social behavior in general, right? Because you're looking at a case of there's some sort of, change in the way that social behavior is expressed or social behaviors are controlled. And that allows you to really see like, okay, so what systems are different? What systems are functioning differently? And I had a great time.
What's interesting to me, this goes to the same thing about your dream where you are in the dreamscape, experiencing it, yet creating it at the same time. And I imagine social behavior is doing the same thing where we have internal circuitry driving us towards or away from it. And that engagement, then the actual social milieu, then feeds back and influences the way we regulate. And so I feel like it's a bit of the same thing, right? Because the more we can create positive social connection, the more, in theory, right, regulated and brain protective that is. And yet that exact experience has the capacity to dysregulate us even as we're trying to create it.
Mhm.
So I'm very curious about, can you digestibly explain the brain circuits involved in empathy, and really what is the importance of empathy in our future in as individuals and humanity? Big question.
Yeah. So, well, let me start by doing a fun little exercise. I'm going to become the interviewer for a second. I want to ask you a question.
Great.
Because everyone seems to have a little bit of a different answer to this. How would you define empathy?
For me, empathy is the capacity to do any of the above: witness, recognize, acknowledge, understand, feel, intuit, or approximate someone else's state or experience or feelings or perspective.
I applaud that definition. That was
Oh,
a
great.
fantastic definition.
That
Yeah,
put me in the hot seat.
I know. Well, yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
it's good. It's good.
No, because a lot of people define empathy as, like helping someone else, or going out of your way to take care of someone when they're sick or something like that, which is also, falls within empathy. But the empathy itself is really exactly what you said. It's the ability to identify what someone else's state is and sort of embody that state yourself. To It's like theory of mind. What's this person experiencing? You can step into their shoes and recognize, ooh, that's a bad experience, maybe I should help them.
Mm-hmm.
Or that's a great experience, I feel happy for them, or I'm jealous of them. It's really the ability to occupy someone else's shoes.
I almost feel like maybe the answer a lot of people give is they're giving a definition of compassion, when in fact compassion is a behavioral expression of the neural circuitry of empathy. That's how I view it.
Absolutely, I would 100% agree. Yeah.
So now we know, right, how important it is to have an understanding of someone else's perspective so that it could lead to compassionate acts, or self-protective acts. I would imagine if you are able to empathize with someone and realize they're volatile or they're in a trauma response and they're not really present, you might need to be self-protective. Where do you see that? What's the importance of that in the future of our world, our humanity, our politics? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere, right? I think recently it seems like we've experienced a down regulation of empathy. It seems like people interact in increasingly inconsiderate ways. A lack of consideration for the other person's state, whether it's through more increasingly hostile political debates, increasingly hostile social media engagements and interactions, or just outright division over all sorts of topics. I think it's critical. I think empathy is really critical for the advancement of the human race. I mean, maybe that's a massive, broad statement, but it's
I don't
important.
know. We're social creatures. We have a prefrontal cortex for a reason. So I feel like, yeah, we are designed for that. I'm curious if, and I'm making a leap here, if empathy is an internal design capacity that all humans have, and I don't know if that's true, but I'm just saying, why is it a natural, easier default to go in the opposite direction of division, divisiveness, and fear? And I that's going to also lead into why you're on social media. But
Yeah. So there are some people who do not experience empathy.
is that
So
considered an anomaly, or is
so yeah, generally, what we would consider psychopaths, those
yeah?
who do not identify with a fear state or a distress state of someone else. So yes, it is considered an anomaly. But generally, most people do experience empathy. And let's take a quick detour, because I think this is a really interesting topic: is why experience empathy? What's the
Mm-hmm.
purpose?
Mm-hmm.
I think looking through an evolutionary lens of everything we do, it has some sort of benefit to our survival fitness. Empathy makes perfect sense, because if you can see, hey, my friend here ate some berries and now she's really, really sick. I should probably, if I can't identify that she's sick, then I'm in trouble if I eat those berries too. So there's evolutionary fitness to recognizing that someone else is in trouble. But why help? Why feel the pressure to save someone else? And I recently did a TikTok video on this. There's something called the perception action model, where there's evidence for this, where basically when you see someone else experiencing a distressed state, let's focus on, or a pain state, there's actually plenty of studies showing that your brain sort of mimics the activity pattern of that state. So if someone's in pain, and you're watching them, the parts of the brain that are activated when you're experiencing pain are partially activated in you, the observer.
And these are the mirror neuron networks. Is that
We think so. I mean,
okay?
well, some, there are hypotheses about that, whether mirror neurons are involved, but no direct evidence yet.
Mhm.
But yeah, there's something going on for sure, right? Because there has to be some sort of system to regulate that, to mimic or imitate the other person's experience. So the question here is like, why would you help the other person? Well, if you're watching someone else experience suffering, and you are, and your brain is mimicking that brain state, then you are there, therefore experiencing suffering. And so there's this question or this hypothesis that maybe empathy is actually a selfish mechanism to relieve yourself of the pain that you are suffering from watching someone else in pain.
Oh, that's fascinating. Nothing is altruistic, I guess, huh?
Yes, exactly.
Wow. But is that even a bad thing? I mean, if acting in self-service is also acting for the greater good, then this is getting very spiritual, which is I am you and you are me.
Mm-hmm.
And so how is that I'm sure people might think that's a bad thing to have the unfolding of empathy be at the root of, self-service, but is it bad?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end, if the outward measurable behavior is that they're helping someone else, who cares how it, what motivates it, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, and sort of the thing about this is it's kind of tough to find an example that doesn't fit into that.
Mm.
When you are walking on the street and you see someone who's homeless and you give them a $10 bill, are you really just doing something out of the kindness of your heart? Or do you see this person and think, oh, to be in that position would be so tough. Let me do a little something to help them.
And the
It's
truth is,
hard.
you're probably going to get a boost in your reward circuitry. So you are going to absolutely get a benefit from
Exactly.
that act.
Right. And then there's another part to this. I mean, now picture that same scenario, but let's say it's me, and let's say I'm walking with my wife, and I think I could probably score some points with my wife right now. She could think I'm really cool if I give this homeless person $20. There's the social benefit as well of kindness, and
Yes.
so I'd like to think that altruism exists. I mean, and of course it does exist, because I could choose to do something kind right now. I mean, I could go on a website and donate $1,000 to a charity, and that is directly impacting me in a negative way, where now I just lost $1,000, but it's helping someone else, and there's no pressure, right? So altruism does exist. You can demonstrate that it exists, but
But
yeah,
you're still going to
whether
get the reward circuitry, give you a little bit of a charitable dopamine. Yay. So it's still going to
right,
feel good.
yeah, exactly, right. I mean, maybe that's kind of the distinction there, is if you can do something that makes you feel bad but makes someone else feel good.
Interesting. But I would even argue that because I take to mind the idea of the martyr, right? Growing up with certain people in my family who acted the martyr role and would sacrifice their comfort and convenience for the sake of others. Even in that, there was some weird reward that they could then say and advertise, I'm a martyr. And there's
Mhm.
an attachment to that identity, which gives them a sense of consistency and comfort and predictability of this is who I am. So I would even argue that people who help even at their own sacrifice could possibly be getting a reward from it. And that's probably not going to be a popular thing that I just said, but I said
No,
it.
but it's a good point. It's a very good point.
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
so
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to take this into an interesting, very different direction. Animals display empathy, uh, and for a while it was thought that animals, do not display compassion or empathy or generosity. There was a recent paper that came out where they trained, I think it was mice, it might have been rats, but it was mice or rats. They had two ports, like little holes where they could poke their nose. It's like a nose poke task. It's very common in mouse research. So they poke their nose and then they get something typically. And so if they poke their nose into one port, they would get a food reward. But if they poke their nose into a second port, they would get a food reward, and a mouse on the other side of a wall would also get a food reward. And they knew that the mouse was getting a food reward. And what they found was that they stopped the port, they closed the port that would only benefit them, And then when they nose poked the remaining port, they wouldn't get a food reward, but the mouse on the other side of the wall would. And they found that the mice continued to nose poke just because, just to give their friend a
Wow.
reward. And they only did it if they knew the mouse on the other side, if they were cage mates with that mouse.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so
Isn't that
this just
interesting?
blows my mind because now this goes to what is us and them. And
Yes.
okay, so I'm so excited. Wait, I got to rein myself in here. Okay. Does this, there's a fine line between becoming the us and helping each other and creating a them and a divide and a foe.
Mhm.
And I am guessing empathy is a slippery slope, kind of like, and forgive my ignorance here, some of the research papers I've read on bonding and oxytocin, where, just a little too much is pretty bad in terms of social inclusion and even things like aggression and racism. So I'm guessing empathy could even go in that direction where there's so much identification with us, but then there's a them. Are you seeing that?
Totally. Yeah, I think, and going back to, pardon, my dog might be barking a little bit. She's a wild one. Yeah, going back to the discussion on division and current, sort of current societal state of empathy, there's so much in grouping and out grouping. You can outgroup someone on the basis of a number of things: their political affiliation, their nationality, their sex, their sexuality. There's so many ways nowadays that people tend to outgroup others. And as soon as that occurs, there seems to be a complete loss of empathy. And it's so problematic, right? Because we are sort of built to be tribal, right? We support those in our tribe. We help our group because why would you help the other group? Maybe they'll attack us. Again, thinking evolutionarily, and it's just so problematic for someone to dismiss another person's emotional state or physical state, state of suffering potentially, just because they don't identify with something about that person. And I think that's what we're starting to see.
I'm really curious. You just made me think of, okay, so when I think of like dopaminergic addiction, like gambling, and there's that, that anticipatory spike that actually can be even higher than the actual win. But then there's that come down, which doesn't feel like we're going back to neutral. It feels like a loss. I'm curious if the downregulation of empathy, does that feel neutral, or does that go into the perception of a deficit, which may translate into aggression, or I don't know. I mean, what does the loss of empathy feel like?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's an interesting question of what is the inverse of empathy? Is it
Right.
aggression? Is it apathy?
Is it
Um,
cruelty? I,
maybe,
I,
yeah. Maybe it's like a form, like a sort of like vengeful behavior. Like you see someone hurt and you allow it to happen, right? Um,
so I guess I'm going to ask a question about psychopaths. And not all psychopaths are vengeful, violent, cruel people. So, but being a psychopath is a marked lack of empathy. So I'm wondering, what does a psychopath feel?
I love the questions you're asking. They're great questions. Yeah, so and that actually is the perfect question to ask, because that does sort of get at the question of what is the inverse of empathy, right? Or what is the lack? Um, and in that case, it would be apathy. It's just sort
Right,
of, neutrality, right?
right,
You see someone hurt and I'm unaffected by it. I don't
right.
really care. Not that I'm a
I have
psychopath,
no, I'm
but
not a stakeholder in that. Yeah,
yeah. So, but sometimes it seems like there's like some take advantage of that ability, right?
yeah.
To inflict pain onto others,
Mm,
and feel no consequence, or maybe some feel a benefit, some feel pleasure from it. But
right.
to be honest, that's a field that I'm not truly well versed in. So I'd be cautious about making any strong claims
Yeah,
myself.
yeah, I understand. I'm curious to lead into your experience with social media, because you're not just using social media to educate, you're actually studying the way social media divides. So in your education, I am guessing there is embedded transmission of unification somehow, because you're actually forging as an influencer in a field and against the momentum of the field. So what's your experience with social media? What should we be wary of?
Yeah. So to start, going back to your original question of how I got into social media, it was essentially an accident. I had never intended to do social media or be an influencer or creator, whatever you want to call me. Um, but what happened was it was the very beginning of the pandemic, and I was familiar with wearing a surgical mask that now everyone has seen and worn. Um, and I went to Walmart and nobody was wearing their masks properly because the general public had, unless you were a nurse or, some sort of medical professional, maybe a scientist, you've never worn one of these. And so nobody was really wearing them right. So I went home and I thought, I'm going to film a video to post on my Facebook and Instagram, just for my friends and family, just explaining how to wear one.
Mm.
And that day, fatefully, I chose to film myself using this new app, TikTok, that I had downloaded. And the only way to save the video was to post it. So I uploaded it, therefore downloaded it, and then posted it on Facebook and said, hey, friends and family, just check it out. Here's a video for how to wear a mask. And the video ended up getting like 1.6 million views on TikTok. It just blew up. And I immediately felt the impact of that, of 1.6 million people who may now better understand how to wear a mask and may therefore, I may have had a tiny little bit of an impact on mitigating the transmission of COVID in the early stages, and the feeling that, holy cow, these platforms can be used to really transmit broadly timely and potentially really important information. It just like dawned on me, and it took a
Mm.
while actually. But I decided to keep posting and answering questions about the brain and stuff. And at first it was just kind of fun. It was a little hobby. And then as I continued to use it, I really developed that understanding that like this is not just a side hobby. This is a tool, and this is an entirely new avenue. And yeah, I've learned a lot. So I mean, there's a lot of directions I could go with this, but probably the most pertinent thing that I'd like to share is that I've learned that for every single comment or stance that you can make or take on the internet, there is always a group of people who stand opposed to you and who are willing to go to extreme lengths to prove to you that they are right and you are wrong.
I'm
And if you
laughing
just
because I experience this all the time.
and yeah, and the sad part is I'm sure most people have experienced it. At one point I actually did a poll of my followers, and I just asked, have you ever been harassed or bullied online? And I think like 85% said yes. And it's awful. I mean, people are just really harsh and critical, and um
What's the
it's
behavioral drive for that?
that question is exactly what I'm interested in studying. It's something that I hope, and I hope no one listening to this is a neuroscientist and says, "Oh, I'm going to do that." But I hope that I'm uniquely positioned to study this specific thing, sort of the neuroscience of social
Yeah.
media.
Just call dibs. That works. It
Yeah,
worked as a kid. So you called
it's
dibs on it.
dibs, everyone. Please
Okay.
don't do it. It's mine. um, but maybe the one thing that would help me is I have many hypotheses about sort of how what's happening, what's going on, and of course it does relate to my research on empathy. And so I have an example of this that I think is really telling. And when I give like PowerPoint presentations, I actually show this video. I posted a video, and there was a college student, and she made a video replying to my video. She showed a few seconds of mine, and then she basically just said, I don't like this video. I don't like this guy. He cherry picks evidence. And it just sort of progressively gets worse and worse and more hostile, where by the end of it, she's like, he's a narcissist and everybody knows it. He likes the blue check mark. And then it just like cuts off abruptly. And it's actually really funny. But when I saw it, it hurts. It hurts to see
Yeah.
someone I've never met, someone who knows nothing about me, just brutally criticizing me. Right. And I commented on it, and I just said something like, wow, like, you're really coming for me. Like, I'm sorry, didn't mean to offend you. And it was pretty astounding because the video was so hostile. And then as soon as she saw my comment, it was like she left like a series of comments. They're like, I'm so sorry. I didn't think you would see this. Like, I was just in a bad mood. I had a bunch of exams and I was grumpy and this and that. And then she also messaged me on Instagram with like a full page length. And so I have a PowerPoint slide where I show like the progression of this, where it was just like, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I didn't think you'd see it. And it was just so interesting to me because it's a beautiful example of the sort of dissociation from a human being where she
Yes.
was a good person. The fact that she went and apologized showed me that she felt compassion, she felt empathy, she felt bad. And so the fact that she sees my video and she thinks I'm just gonna let loose on this guy and just say anything bad about him, it doesn't matter. And then as soon as I become a real person that engages with it, suddenly there's this deep sense of compassion and she just becomes very apologetic. And I think
Well,
it's a great example of what we
this is the
see.
crazy part of the internet because, I mean, now that we've moved into video, it's better because we still get like social inputs like tone of voice and facial expression. But without the video, we've got just raw posts lacking any social input that our entire nervous system is oriented to want and need in order to understand the nature and the intent of the interaction. And that's gone. We don't see each other as humans on the internet. And amazing case in point that you just had, the moment you're a human to her, it's a different ball game. And so does the metaverse potentially help ameliorate that because we're interacting? I don't know. Like, I don't even know where the metaverse is going to go with all of
Yeah.
this. It could be a rehumanizing of the digital world, or it could be a further dissociation. Do you have thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
I do. My hypothesis is that have you ever seen a video, or maybe you've seen it in real life, where you have two dogs on opposite sides of a fence and they're barking and they're snarling and their teeth are out and stuff, and then you open the fence door and they just like
Yeah,
trot
yeah,
in and
yeah.
sniff each other. It's like something about when they're on the opposing sides of the fence, there's no true threat of violence, right? And so it's easy for the brain to unleash this anger and hostility and it's the same kind of thing on social media, and you see it all the time too. Another example of this is, you're talking to a friend and you're like, oh, I can't believe what Mark did. That was horrible. Like if I see him, I'm just gonna tell him how I feel. And then you see Mark and you're like, oh, hi Mark, how you doing? And it's like it's easy to express anger until there's an actual potentially a threat of damage, right? Maybe this is also an evolutionary thing where maybe Mark is going to throw a punch if you call him out. And on social media there's no threat of backlash. There's no
Mm. There's no
uh,
tangible consequence in the three-dimensional world, at least up front there isn't.
exactly. And so
Yeah.
I don't think the metaverse would fix it. I don't necessarily think that the problem is like the social cues associated with like seeing a person, seeing an avatar, and they're talking to you. I think it might make people friendlier in general because
Hmm.
there's more of a live interaction,
Hmm.
but it certainly won't stop people from screaming at each other. I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard of like Call of Duty lobbies or anything like video game lobbies. People are just horrible. They say
Yeah.
terrible things and they yell at each other and they use slurs, and it's like notoriously an awful place. And it's just really too bad. I mean, I think there's something really interesting to study there neuroscientifically, and I hope to get at that.
I always view neuroscience and any science really through the lens of it always sort of converts into spirituality for me, and I'm not saying it should for other people, but for me it does. And so when I think of what's the brain doing when we have permission and lack of consequences, what's the brain doing to like drive us towards aggressive behavior, all those things, right? For me, it comes down to, because I do get some of those little hate comments. If I feel like I'm enough, do I then need to make other people wrong? Or can I give them the space to be who they are because I feel like I'm enough? And when I don't feel like I'm enough, if someone's perspective is bumping against that, then I come out with a threat response. And so I always convert it into how it feels in my body. And when I don't feel like I'm enough, I'm a nasty judgmental person internally, and sometimes it slips out of my mouth as well. When I feel like I'm enough, I have so much more resourced compassion and empathy. So somewhere in this whole neuroscience equation is the participation of an identity story that may not be the sum total reason for the circuitry doing what it does, but it's a player in either the expression of that circuitry or the modulation of that circuitry. I'm curious what you feel about this I'm enough concept.
Totally. I think so. My content that I share is all educational, right? And I think another sort of way of like defining what you're saying is a sense of vulnerability. And when I share a video that is not my specific research topic, right? This isn't something I've done a PhD in, I know really well. I read a paper, I made a video about it. And someone comments, no, you're wrong, or this is the wrong interpretation of the results, or someone calls me out pretty much. I immediately become very anxious, and I become much more likely to engage because I feel vulnerable. I feel like there's a lack of confidence in my understanding of the material. And I think that that's a different form of expressing that full sort of vulnerability. But for everyone, it's different, you know, or maybe you post a picture in a bathing suit and someone says something about your body and it's something that you're, you know, sensitive to. I really do think it's sort of this, you know, sense of vulnerability and sensitivity that causes a lot of the, you know, conflict that we engage in on social media. And not to move into a different direction, but my number one thing that I would like everyone to know is that if anyone ever comments something mean that does make you feel bad or doesn't, either way, if they're mean and you feel any impulse to reply, don't reply. I have learned this the hard way, that the more you engage in conflict, the worse it gets. Because first off, it's terrible for your psyche. I found that if someone comments something and I reply, I close the app, I go back to doing some other work, and I'm like, I wonder if they replied yet. I
So
might have to
isn't
go
it
check.
a bit of an addiction too? And how difficult it is to overcome an addiction when that impulse arises, but it almost becomes addictive to why is that so addictive when the 5,000 other comments were like, yay, thank you for this video.
Yes, exactly, right? You tend to focus on the negative comments. Yeah, I'm not sure. And it seems to occupy so much more real estate in your mind. You know, you're thinking about, I wonder who this person is. I wonder if, you know, do I know them, or are they a random person?
Do you
And
think it's an evolutionary trait where the one potential adversary was the thing we had to watch so we could devise protective strategies? I mean, is it a relic of that? And
I think
now
so.
we're actually looking for it because we have nothing really to protect ourselves against environmentally. I mean, okay, big things, yes. Cataclysms, yes. But the day to day, I mean, we have air conditioning, we have heat, we have indoor plumbing. I almost feel like this evolutionary trait has nowhere to go, but now it funnels itself into these opportunities to like nitpick each other.
Yeah, that's an interesting theory. I mean, absolutely. Threat has always been more important than, you know, warmth, right?
And so there's an aliveness, I think, that we can feel. I mean, we all know how adrenaline feels. And I know that when I get those comments on social media, I do get a flush. I get hot and it feels alive. And you're like ready to go. So there is an aliveness that plays into this aggressive, I think, attacking of each other. I feel like.
Yeah, well, so here's an interesting potential question. After that rush subsides and, you know, the argument's over and it's the next day, then how do you feel about it?
Really annoyed that I allocated all of that time and energy and feel like now I'm at a deficit. And
Yeah.
then sometimes, and I don't know if you notice this, sometimes then it bleeds into Do I then overcompensate next time, next post, next video to sort of level out the scales of, yeah,
Yeah,
do you feel that? Do you?
of the reputational scales or
Yes.
the ethical or morality scales.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to it. I think for one, it's public, right? You're engaging in these discussions or maybe arguments on a public platform where everyone can see it. So you may feel that social pressure to sort of tip the scales back in favor of a positive attitude. But I definitely feel annoyed, just like you, of, oh, I wish I didn't spend all that time. And I feel aggravated that, that definitely influenced my the way I engage in other tasks. And I often feel shame. I often feel
Mm-hmm.
shameful about having done that and having, fought with someone else on the internet and having created an enemy, even if it's an anonymous person somewhere on the
Mm-hmm.
internet. But it kind of reminds me of, going back to what you're saying about like that dip, right? That dopamine dip after obtaining a reward. But I think in this case, it's conflict without meaningful resolution is not evolutionarily beneficial, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
it's just a distraction. And that's what it's always going to be on social media. You're never going to have a meaningful discussion. If someone comments something that they disagree with you, you're never ever ever going to enlighten them. Even if your points are better than theirs and are very clear, you're never going to win because people are stubborn and they don't like to admit that they're wrong. And that's
Very
fine,
true.
but
Very
just
true.
don't engage. It's
Don't
it's much
engage.
better if you don't.
I'm taking that as the number one tip of the day for me. So I know we're coming to the close of our time, and I have two questions for you. The first is, what are you working on that you're most excited about right now?
Right now, as in like today, or right now, as in like my life.
Your life.
They'd be different answers.
Yeah.
So this is like partially confidential, but I will kind of like declassify it in a way.
You do know
Um,
this is a podcast that people are watching, so
yeah,
okay.
it's okay.
Okay, go
Well,
ahead.
I wow, this could be a really lengthy answer. Basically, I don't know how exactly I want to spend my life. For a long time, I've been interested in just doing a traditional academic role, right? Being a professor, running a research lab. And then I stumbled into social media and I felt that impact that I described.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that this could really be a valuable and powerful tool. And I've been trying to think of ways that I can sort of achieve both because I
Mm-hmm.
find both very satisfying and fun. So, what I've been thinking about doing is trying to develop sort of an academic center that would focus on social media and science communication and train students to convey their research to the public, to translate scientific jargon into lay terms and
It's the
and
bridge.
also yeah and also potentially do some research on this type of stuff like I was talking about while maintaining a neuroscience career, research lab and teaching neuroscience and stuff. And so it turns out it's very difficult to just sort of reach out to a university and say, hey, how about building a big old center? Um, but it's a sort of a project of mine right now. And so it's something I'm very excited
I
about.
feel like it's a really important bridge. I feel like all the, Coursera's and the MOOCs out there were like the first phase of the bridge building. And now, with more immediate instant gratification and mastery of the social media, I feel like that's where we have to go. It's where we have to
Yeah.
go because the nature of academic institutions are changing. People aren't showing up in person, they're doing things online, and people are googling, Google Scholar and getting research done there. And I feel like I don't know, I get really excited when I hear you talk about that. So
Well,
I'm going
thank
to
you.
put it out there that I hope that happens. Um, okay, two things our listeners can do to enhance empathy.
So I will say the research that I'm doing now, I also can't talk in great detail about it, but all I will say is that what I'm doing is basically using um, pharmacological agents, drugs, one might say, to enhance certain brain systems to enhance empathy. And so we're trying to figure out through that, like, which brain systems regulate empathy and therefore which brain systems could be targeted. So the only real answer I could give right now that I know for sure would be a drug answer. And I'm not going to give that answer because we're really using it as more of a mechanistic tool. But I think just in general, you know, as a sort of human answer, you know, as we've discussed, I think try to, first off, when you're on social media, for one, try to, you know, avoid hostility. Try to think about, right now we're all going through kind of a bad time. It's sort of a bad time to exist, I would think. It feels like it, at least. And so I think it's really interesting that we're all connected through social media for the first time ever, you know, and because of that, you might think that there's greater communication and greater understanding and maybe peace, but there's not. We're seeing the exact opposite of that. And I think that's really fascinating and unfortunate, you know, that people use this vast accessibility of everyone to create division and fight each other. And so I think, especially right now when we're all living in a pretty challenging time, I think we should probably try to emphasize kindness and be more nice to each other in general. So, you know, before you leave that comment, just think about how you might feel if you received that comment and what the real intention of that comment is. You know, are you just killing time on the internet and you're kind of mindlessly leaving a comment? Or are you actively trying to hurt someone? Because probably you're not. Probably you're not actively trying to hurt someone. Because if you were, I don't think it would feel the same. I think, I don't know, people just sort of leave these comments. So on social media, you know, take a second, breathe, be kind. In person, I think, you know, as we talked about with the outgrouping, you know, maybe kind of do the same thing. I think it's just important to sit back and reflect on, like, why do I not feel a sense of compassion for this person? Is it because, like, why am I willing to be hostile and angry and not express empathy? Is it because I see something different about them from me? Is it because I see them as a threat? You know, I think generally empathic behaviors are kind behaviors. And so if maybe it's contagious, maybe if more people are kind and generous, then others will be too. And maybe it can start a sort of chain reaction. I mean, you see this in like like I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and it's called the city of good neighbors, and everyone's just really nice, you know. It's just sort of continuously, like, it's one of those cities where you go in to get a coffee and you're in a drive-through and the person in front of you just pays for yours for no reason. And so you pay for the person behind you. Or I've actually had a situation where I was in my car and I was snowed in, and like 3 or 4 homeless guys came over and just pushed me out for no reason. And it's just sort of this generosity, this pay it forward. So, you know, I think maybe it feels like a deficit to help someone else when no one's helping you, but maybe just if we all kind of put one more step into positivity and empathy, then maybe it'll be contagious, and it's kind of, you know, kumbaya, but maybe it'll make a difference.
Well, I love that we're talking about how as individuals we can glue together groups and then ultimately have that ripple out into humanity, which then leads me to reflect on a conversation I had with Avi Loeb, who is, you know, astrophysicist. He's at the forefront right now of the Galileo project, which is exploring, you know, intelligent life and artifacts that he believes may have come from interstellar systems that had intelligent life. And his perspective is, if we realize as a humanity that there are billions of other blue planets around suns, and likely as many other civilizations that have existed, then maybe we can come together globally as a we. And so I think it's the macro, right? We're talking about the individual. We're talking about the micro, right? The neural circuitry. Then we're talking about the social engagement, which is at the individual level. And then we're talking about this big thing, which is we're one species. And if we really truly believed or knew that there was other civilizations out there, would we still be making the comments to each other on social media? Or would we be grabbing each other's hands and saying, whoa, that's the them, This is the us. So what I love to do at the end of my podcast is just give a few kernels, what I'm going to take from this and chew on and really think about, so that you, the listener, can do the same thing. And maybe you took your own notes. I'm a note taker. So here's what I'm going to really chew on. Well, first, I found it fascinating that all of your paths, you called them unintentional, including the impetus to go down these paths, which was a dream. You're extremely driven by subconscious information. It's fascinating. Anyway, that's a total side. Here's the kernels I took that I'm going to digest. That empathy is the ability to recognize each other's states. That perception action model, that when we witness the pain in others, we actually have an experience of that pain. The idea that we're really good at in-grouping and out-grouping, and that we can actually do things about that to change it. And that we don't have to actually follow the impulse to defend ourselves on social media, because it doesn't really have the effect that we're looking for. And then the last thing, which I think is a great reminder for all time and all people, is pay it forward. So Ben, I'm so lit up from this conversation. I have all these ideas. Probably going to have you back and talk about them, especially after some of the current research you're doing is out there, so that we can get another glimpse. But I so appreciate the time you took today.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me. And this was genuinely fun. I really enjoyed your questions.
Awesome. How can people get more of you?
So probably the hub is just go to my website. It's just benrein.com, BENREIN.com. And there's everything. You can download my PDFs of my papers if you are so inclined. No paywalls. They're just PDFs. Hopefully I don't get in trouble from the publishers. There's, you can access my social media platforms. I think my CV might be on there if you're interested. Everything. There's a message box. That's probably the way to go. So, and I thank you for your interest.
Excellent. I think everyone needs to look at your Instagram channel and your TikTok channel, because your videos are great. So thank you again, and we will do this again soon.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to it. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks for listening to Unlock Hope. If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're at Neurosculpting Institute on Facebook, at Neurosculpting on Instagram. You can always reach out to us on our website, neurosculpting.com, and you can download our app, Neuropraxis. Stay well, everybody.